Episode 26 of the Consistency Podcast is here. My name's Steve from Gloucester. And to start, I continue to read complaints on social media from people still unhappy with the content being discussed on the Kirk Minihane Show, and I find this completely wild. The one thing I never read is how these haters would quote-unquote fix the show. You see, there are professional trolls out there, or people I love to call the social media seagulls. And we all know who they are. It's the same dozen or so people who love to stir the pot on all the social media platforms. They post their nonsense whenever something goes wrong with the show, but they'll never ever offer solutions. They feast on the KMS errors like seagulls do bread that's tossed their way. And living in Gloucester, Massachusetts, I can tell you that feeding the seagulls is not good for them or anyone. You can definitely Google it for more information. Yet what I see online is that people will fuel the egos of the social media seagulls by liking, commenting, or reposting their nonsense. This needs to stop. But have these seagulls ever once expressed how they would quote-unquote fix the show? Now, I know people will say that I was one of the biggest complainers out there. It's true. I wrote a strongly worded letter to the show. I created the Consistency Podcast. I get it. However, the separation from myself and the seagulls is that I backed up those complaints. I picked up the phone when Kirk called. I never turned down an invitation to the studio, nor will I ever. And I gave Kirk 10 of the most dreadful ideas on how to improve the show. He basically laughed me out of the studio because they were terrible. But the point is that I went in there with ideas and perspectives. So where are these social media seagulls? Where are their ideas? How come they don't go into studio? Kirk welcomes all of them into the studio, but they never show up. And from what I know, there isn't much of a vetting process to go in. All they need to do is reach out to Justin or Coleman and they're pretty much on. But you know why these seagulls won't go in? Because it's their online bit and they really don't hate the show. And if they go in, they'll be crucified by Kirk and it will hurt their social media brand. It will hurt their egos. I mean, who's going to take the seagulls seriously once they get shown up by Kirk? And what's even more hilarious, what really cracks me up, is that these so-called haters make excuses as to why they can't go in. Oh, they have to work. They have a family commitment, appointments. So the same people that are on Reddit, the show chat, and Twitter for hours a day magically have something to do when Kirk calls them out. Believe that, huh? Wow, all of a sudden they can't come in. I mean, honestly, when will the complaining end? And yes, this is a pot calling the kettle black, but I did learn from my mistakes of the past, and I don't complain as much as I used to, because I realize now more than ever that complaining isn't going to get us anywhere. I mean, even though Kirk is one of the few people that welcome the complaints, they just don't materialize into anything, and it's just not the way to go. I mean, you wouldn't walk in to the kitchen of a restaurant and complain to the head chef that your meal stunk. You wouldn't go behind the bar and tell the bartender how to properly make a drink. So why do you and the seagulls on social media feel entitled that you can tell Kirk how to run his show? I just don't get it. And let me be clear. My complaints were never about the content of the show. A lot of the shows, even the ones produced by Gus, weren't bad. The problem is that we could never get to the content as the topics weren't properly introduced. They weren't prepared well. The producers didn't understand them. And this essentially paused the show and frustrated Kirk to no end. And it wasn't until changes were made to the production side that the show got back on track. And of course, I get it. This isn't the good ship lollipop. And we are entitled to share our opinions, good or bad. But you guys need to figure out, and this is more towards the social media seagulls, they have to understand that complaining is resulting in less Kirk. He's already cut the show down to 3 times a week. And he's also said that he won't record shows when he's doing Barstool stuff. And here's a newsflash. He is doing more of that stuff, so we are going to see less KMS. And honestly, I think it's a good thing. I mean, hasn't this week proved that less is actually better? I mean, I personally enjoyed the only show that was on this week, and it was great once the air was cleared in the beginning. I mean, the movie talk with Justin, the Clemmer call, and the look ahead to Blind Mike's trip to Austin, Texas to go on with Lauren Compton was great. And Lauren Compton, by the way, is a stunner. But what I thought was even better was what we saw this week when the show wasn't live. The people at Starbucks not being able to spell Kirk's name right for multiple days was as confusing as it was funny. I mean, I can understand people not being able to spell Genevieve, but Kirk seems rather easy. How could they screw that up? And the uncovering of the Andy Mayo comedy routine and the special Why Are You Laughing episode, I mean, that was like hitting a scratch ticket for $1,000. I mean, why didn't Mayo, who defines clout chaser, why did he keep this from Kirk? Especially his last time in the studio. This is something you bring up. You have Kirk break your chops, and then it goes into the history books. But you know what? You know Mayo. I mean, this could be his master plan to get more FaceTime in the studio with Kirk. So maybe it was one of his diabolical plans and ideas that he has going on. I mean, either way, that comedy set was cringy at best, but you have to give Mayo his day's due for attempting something that most of us wouldn't. Then you had the other great moments this week, the back and forth with Anna Horford, Justin's trip to Milton's, the trip to Hooters, the screening of Madam Web, and the producer show. I mean, they kept us all entertained. And this was all stuff we would never have gotten from producers in the past, including Steve Robinson. I mean, Coleman and Justin gave us content on what would have historically been a dead week. You got to give these guys credit. So what would I do to fix the show? My answer is nothing. The producers are working hard on the internet issues, and they seem to have pretty much resolved the issues surrounding the communication when the show isn't live. And hasn't this been the best Kirk we've seen in the studio in months? I mean, the Barstool talent that contributes to KMS, the in-studio guests have been great. The lack of calls continues to be refreshing. So I would continue to preach patience to everyone and just enjoy the show, even if it's just 3 days a week. Make the best of it. Now, I'm sure the social media seagulls are gonna have a field day with this. After all, you know these guys, they love spending time doing their bits, slamming people like myself who legit don't read the comments or don't post much publicly, but they're still gonna do it. Because I've realized, and I wish more people would do this, doing the Jimmy Conway Goodfellas approach is the way to shut these people down. If you give them nothing, then they get nothing. And from what I can see with Kirk, unless these seagulls scale back their negativity, then we're going to see less and less of Kirk, which is going to be the real travesty. And I hope these guys think about this the next time they post how much they dislike the show. Now, moving on, it was great to hear Kirk mention that Glenn Ordway is a fan of the show and the network and that he might be on an episode of KMS or more than one episode in 2024. Those of you who live in the Boston area or New England know just how big of a personality Glenn was in the Boston sports world. I mean, he was the king of WEEI for decades. He was our version of Mike and the Mad Dog. The big show itself was appointment listening. I mean, you needed to hear what Glenn had to say about what was going on in the Boston sports world. And I'm sure you guys who listen to the show remember the Weena Wine line at the end of each show. I mean, that was a must listen. And, you needed to make the cut just to get your message played because there were so many funny one-liners on the Weiner line. And, Glenn made names of some of the sports and political personalities that we know today. I mean, Michael Felger, Tony Maserati, Jerry Callahan, and even Kirk got their radio careers started or promoted by Glenn or working with Glenn. So, a lot of people look up to Glenn and respect him in the Boston radio world. And, I'm sure a lot of people won't enjoy when Glenn's on, but I'm really going to look forward to it. It's going to be great to hear from the Big O. And the one thing I do wonder is how Portnoy's going to take this. Because from those of you that remember the old WEEI days, there was a lot of friction and bad blood between Dave and the Big O over the years. And I think it was like 7 or 8 years ago that they really had it out on an episode of Kirk and Callahan. So it's going to be interesting to see if there's still some animosity between those two. And I honestly wouldn't be surprised if Kirk has Portnoy call in when Glenn's on. I mean, that's going to be great if that happens. So definitely stay tuned for that. And speaking of Kirk and Dave, I thought this week's Unnamed podcast was a C at best. It was a rough opening to the show, and the inability to hear Kirk clearly a few minutes in was an indicator that this show was going to be subpar. I mean, it just didn't start off well, and it didn't really progress as the show went on. I mean, Kirk and Ryan Whitney did their best to save the show, and they were willing to go after people, and they wanted to go after Dave, and they did go after Dave when, he tries to play his I'm richer than you act card, and it still seemed like the show wasn't going anywhere. It just didn't get any traction. And, don't get me wrong, I love dogs, and I love the fact that Dave and others own rescue dogs. That's a great thing. But does a dog really need a social media account or an $8,000 dog bowl? I mean, seriously. This is just Dave being Dave and doing it to stroke his own ego. I mean, most people don't make $8,000 in 2 months, and Dave spends it on a dog bowl. I mean, what are we doing here? I mean, I wonder if Dave's ever heard the phrase tone deaf. I mean, he's totally gonzo. And then Dave has a chance to crucify Smitty for what he said about Dave or to Dave, which 99.9% of the people out there don't condone. But it seemed like all Dave wanted to do was hustle Smitty off so that he could tell us more about Miss Peaches. I mean, Kirk and Whitney were definitely eager to dive into it. They really wanted to, crucify Smitty a little bit, but Dave just didn't want to do it, which was, again, wild to me. Then you have this exhausting bit with trying to make Jersey Jerry out to be a bigger star than he is. I mean, to be fair, I'm a huge fan of Jerry. I personally spent years struggling with addiction myself until I quit almost 3 years ago. So I root for people like Jerry, and I love the fact that he's maintaining his sobriety. But it just feels like the people at Barstool are trying too hard to turn hamburger into filet mignon when it comes to Jerry. I mean, he's funny, he's a good guy, but he just isn't that talented. And this stuff about him believing the people on Reddit is mind-boggling. I don't get it. I mean, someone could convince me that Santa Claus, the Easter Bunny, the Tooth Fairy, and the Leprechaun on the Lucky Charms box were eating breakfast at their kitchen table. before I would believe anything from that cesspool known as Reddit. So I couldn't believe why Jerry was bringing that up. And to close, there is this forced exercise concerning the call sheet and who is running the sheet or the list that, again, it just felt overly dramatic. The on-air talent is great, but it just seems like there's too many cooks in the kitchen behind the scenes that could honestly make pouring a glass of milk confusing. The show needs one voice behind the scenes, be it Austin or Coleman, and Kirk needs to be the one who runs the show, as he's clearly the only one of the three that has the ability to keep the show on the road. This show has so much more potential than it's shown, but something needs to change and quickly before we are talking about what or who led to the demise of this show. I mean, it's just not looking good. I'm a huge fan, but man, I don't know what to think of this show anymore. And as we wrap up, I again want to thank everyone who have continued to reach out to me privately. As you know, the internet and social media is filled with many more good apples than bad. And your support has me feeling a lot better than I have in the past few weeks. So I'm internally grateful for this. I hope that you all take care of yourselves and, those that bring joy to you. And I'll talk to you soon.